record to the cloud. So that link in the chat is where this session will be posted also after we are finished today. Today's session is data visualization, and our guest speaker is Dr. Annie Specht. She is an associate professor and agricultural communication program coordinator. Dr. Specht is a graduate of The Ohio State University and Texas A&M University. She serves as an associate professor and undergraduate coordinator in agricultural communication program in the ACEL department. Her research interests include media portrayals of agriculture, visual communication, and popular culture. Her teaching areas of expertise include multimedia production, publication design, news and feature writing and editing, and data visualization. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Dr. Specht, and hopefully you are able to share your screen if you need to.
I think that I can. So let me go ahead and do that real quick. And then let me get my PowerPoint up and running here.
No problem.
Oh, can you see my presenter slides or can you see the actual slideshow?
I see the presenter screen.
Okay, let's do this. How about now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. All right. I always get PowerPoint and Zoom don't always play well together, unfortunately, but thank you everyone for joining me today. As Summer said, my name is Annie Specht, and I am an associate professor in agricultural communication here at Ohio State. And we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics today, which is data visualization. So this is something that I got into through my interest in visual communications and my teaching of graphic design to our undergraduate and some of our graduate students. So really the thing that I want everyone to remember is that if you work in extension, you work in science communication in some capacity. We tend to think of, communicators as only being people who have communicator in their title, but the outreach work that we do, the extension work that we do, it has a massive communication component. And one of the things that we can do to help augment our communication of our information to our stakeholders is to use data visualizations in a variety of different forms. So what those forms are some of the things that we're going to talk about today. Whoops, let me advance my slide here. So we're going to talk a little bit about what data visualization is, because I think we have kind of some misconceptions about what data viz actually entails. So we're going to talk through that a little bit. We're going to talk about some things that we want to keep an eye out in data visualizations writ large, and maybe in some of the data visualizations that we create as we share information with our stakeholders. And then we're going to talk about some tools that you can use for creating visualizations to use in your own communications projects. So we're going to get started with what data visualization actually is. So this is the time where, even though it's 9 a.m. on a Thursday, we're going to have a little bit of audience participation if anyone wants to chime in. So what do you think of when you hear the term data visualization? What kind of comes to mind for everyone? And feel free to chime in, put it in the chat, however you want to share that.
Charts or graphs?
Charts or graphs, absolutely.
Infographics?
Infographics, yep. And we had graphs in the chat. We've got putting data in a way that is understandable and related, absolutely. How to present the data we have in different formats, for sure. All of these are great responses. So data visualization, whoops, as I go the opposite direction. So data visualization is actually something that predates a lot of written language. So data visualization is typically considered to have started back with the ancient Egyptians, because they were the first map makers. So these were folks who were using cuneiform and clay tablets to create maps and other visual tools to help them navigate various places. So data visualization is actually one of the oldest means of communication that we have. We've been communicating in images for just as long as we've been communicating in spoken or written language, which is something that I don't think people always realize. This is something that really, is part of human civilization. So I like to define data visualization as this idea of translation. So what we are doing is we are translating usually statistical information into some sort of visual language. And all of this is predicated on the idea of the pictorial superiority effect. So the pictorial superiority effect basically states that if you see a word, you are 10% like your recall, your ability to recall the word that you saw after 72 hours is about 10%. So about 10% of people can recall a word that they read a couple of days later. However, if you show someone a picture, that recall after 72 hours actually goes up to about 65%. So what we're seeing here is that, words are obviously hugely useful in the way we communicate, but pictures tend to kind of stick in the mind a lot longer than simply written words. So we call this the pictorial superiority effect, thinking about the way that pictures, again, kind of tend to stick around a little bit longer in our memory versus written or spoken words. Yes, so this is one of the reasons why, when you're putting together PowerPoints and slides and other presentation materials, it's really helpful to put pictures instead of words and kind of augment images with written words or spoken words. All right. So the way that I handle data visualization really focuses on sort of the graphic design aspect of it. And part of that is because we tend to think about data visualization, as our responses indicate, as graphs and charts and kind of traditional visualizations. But what we have to remember is that not all visualizations are created equal. So not all visualizations are going to be as effective depending on the audience that we're trying to reach or the data that we're trying to share. So I actually have an example from, and I will say this is Oklahoma State, a different OSU extension. And this was actually shared by a colleague of mine at Oklahoma State University, so I don't feel bad sharing it publicly. He tweeted it out and allowed me to use it in my presentation here. So here we have an infographic, basically a county map of the state of Oklahoma, looking at the presence of kudzu vine, which, as many of us probably know, is an invasive plant species that tends to choke out a lot of other native plants. What might be a problem with this particular visualization? You can feel free to chime in verbally, feel free to throw your ideas in the chat.
Those layers of gray are hard to see.
The layers of gray are hard to see, absolutely. So you've got this sort of, that essentially your key has some issues. Yes, some colorblind folks might struggle, especially those who have red-green color blindness. My fiance is one of those people. And yes, Austin, we associate green with growth, and it says not present. And Beth also picked up on this. If you look at the key in this particular visualization, you will see that green indicates where kudzu vine doesn't exist, not necessarily where it does exist. And because we associate the color green with plant life in a lot of ways, we would expect that the counties that are shaded in green would actually have kudzu vine. And in fact, we see that that is the opposite. So when I talk about data visualizations not being as effective as they could be, this is a perfect example where we have a color choice drastically reducing the effectiveness of a chart or a graph because it wasn't very thoughtfully created. They didn't think about the associations of green with, growth and plants and our expectation that we might find plants in those areas that are colored green. I love that one. We're going to come back to it too, just because I like hounding Oklahoma State about that. So what I like to think about, and I teach a class on data visualization and scientific storytelling. And one of the reasons why I incorporate storytelling here is that that's exactly what data visualization is about. It's about translation. It's about storytelling, taking something that's very static and turning it into something that's a little bit more dynamic and interesting to people to interact with. So we can tell stories with our data in a couple of different ways. We can base those stories on patterns, for example. So these might be patterns that we see emerging over time. These might be patterns that we see among groups, among different regions, various other ways of kind of breaking the data up. So, when we think about patterns, patterns are very visual in a lot of cases. And this was a visualization I came across on on a website dedicated to sharing creative and unique data visualizations. And this was basically a color bar chart that was put together based on the colors of cardigan sweaters that Mr. Rogers wore in every episode of his show as we moved through the time span of the show. So here you can see, some patterns emerging in the color stories that he used. And he started out with lots of greens and blues and yellows, and then moved into these kind of warmer colors as the show moved on. So these are ways that we can tell some really interesting stories without using words. Identifying these patterns and thinking of really cool and creative ways to visualize these patterns. I'll have to remember which site I sent this on, or I found this on, and I'll share it in the chat if I can identify it. So we can also tell stories based on relationships. So, those of us who have taken stats courses throughout our coursework kind of have an idea of correlation, right? So we're really good at spotting correlations. And then we have those sort of cause and effect relationships that we can also find kind of interesting ways to visualize. So one of the visualizations that I found that kind of talks about correlations or cause and effect is looking at divorce rates by occupation. So basically looking at different types of employment opportunities and how that potentially impacts people's marital status. And so one of the things that I found really interesting about here, you can kind of see this like cluster tree chart here. Bartenders and gaming managers, so people who work in like casinos, tend to have higher rates of divorce than actuaries. And what do actuaries do in their day job? They manage risk, right? That's their entire job. So here we see this really interesting chart that kind of identifies these outliers in a way that is really, really easy to spot where those outliers are. So we've got this kind of cool visualization that allows us to kind of pinpoint, okay, here, we've got lots of jobs clustered around that median area, but then we see these really, really strong outliers, and they're, nice. So we've got these really strong outliers that we can identify really easily by choosing a data visualization that allows us to pinpoint where those outliers actually are. So if you want to have an improved chance of marital or relationship happiness, maybe don't go work in a bar, maybe don't go work in a casino, and instead follow Misty's daughter's advice and study actuarial science. All right. And so the thing that we have to remember at the end of the day, if we are using charts, if we're using graphs, if we're using infographics, the best visualization that we choose is going to depend on the data that we're looking at. Perry is an author whose textbooks I use in my classes that I teach on this subject. And their big point here is that visualizations should be accurate. First and foremost, we don't want to tell lies with our visualizations, just like we don't want to tell lies with our statistics. They should be easy to comprehend, because the whole point of putting data into a visualization is to make it easier to understand. They should be aesthetically pleasing. People should want to look at them. So thinking about like that Mr. Rogers chart, how interesting and beautiful that was. And they should also be appropriate to the context that you're sharing them in. So you're not going to choose, a really complicated statistical chart in an infographic that you're going to send to like second graders, right? You got to think about who your audience is and what kind of visualization is appropriate for that audience. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different types of visualizations here. So we absolutely have the traditional ones that a lot of which were mentioned in the chat at the beginning of the presentation. Charts, graphs, photos, we can consider a form of data visualization, line drawings, etc. So, anatomical sketches, those sorts of things all would fall under kind of that traditional data viz category. And then kind of upping the ante a little bit, we've got some of our less traditional visualizations. So pictorial charts, things like word clouds, for those of you who do lots of semantic analysis like I do, where we're always like talking about language and the word choices that people use. Word maps or word clouds work really well for things like that. Heat maps are hugely popular for doing different types of visual communication studies, website analyses, and those sorts of things. Graphics that you can actually interact with that have like rollovers and think pop-ups and things that actually occur as you're kind of moving through the visualization. And then we had infographics mentioned at the beginning of the presentation as well. So infographics where we have this combination of data, words, images, kind of putting it all together in kind of a neat little package. One of the things that might be helpful to remember is that the more novel or unusual the form of data visualization you choose, the more memorable it tends to be. So one of those things that kind of sticks in my mind, I always remember that tree graph with the actuaries and the bartenders at opposite ends. I think just because we don't see those very often in the type of research and the type of social science that I do. And there was a study done by some researchers at Harvard that found that unusual graphs like tree diagrams, other unusual types of statistical graphs tend to be more memorable than things like bar charts and pie graphs. So that's another thing to consider. If you are using something that falls kind of under that traditional category, there might be some additional ways to spice that up rather than just using what we traditionally think of as charts and graphs. All right, and if at any point in time there are questions that you want to put in the chat, I am monitoring, so please feel free to do so. So we're going to move into this idea of spotting issues with data visualizations. And the old adage goes, of course, statistics don't lie, but you can lie with statistics. And because a lot of data visualizations are based on statistical information, it is possible to have data visualizations that distort the findings or present, findings incorrectly. We're going to kind of talk through how you can spot some of those in your work or in other visualizations that you might be sharing with your stakeholders. So we talked about this one a little bit, right? Where a very simple error in color choice judgment can influence the way that you read a visualization. Here we have a poor color choice indicating the lack of something that we would expect to actually find based on the color that was chosen. We're going to talk through what some other examples are. All right, so one of our favorite is the good old truncated axis. So truncated axes basically means that you start your graph somewhere that's not zero, right? You see this a lot in media coverage of polling and issues that are incredibly kind of politically polarizing. We tend to see these things happen a lot around political issues and scientific issues that have a really strong partisan component. So when we're looking at truncated axes, these are the kinds of things that can happen. So here, the example on the left, you'll see it actually starts at 10 and then drops to -11, right? So basically we are kind of emphasizing the differences here. If we look at an axis that actually starts, I think that's actually supposed to be -10. So it goes -10 to -14 or -15. The one on the right, the version on the right, starts at 0 and has a much longer y-axis, right? So we're looking at a more accurate representation of the changes in the data. The left-hand example looks a lot more dramatic than the right-hand example looks because we are working with just sort of a snippet of that information as opposed to the whole big picture. So like I said, we tend to see these in situations where we want to see results kind of exaggerated for some type of dramatic effect. But from a scientific standpoint and a visual literacy standpoint, this is a really bad practice to fall into. So definitely something to kind of look at. We also have this idea of mismatching the visual that we're using and the data. So I'm going to show you an example that does a really good job of kind of explaining what we're talking about here. So this was a political map that was shared a lot, I believe, around the 2016 presidential election. So obviously a very contentious time in American politics. And I saw this on social media a lot, especially from some of my peers who tend to be a little bit more right-leaning on the political spectrum. And so what we end up seeing here is this, county map of all of the counties in the United States. And you can see the counties that voted for a Democratic presidential candidate represented in blue, counties that voted in a Republican, for the Republican candidate highlighted in red. The problem with this, and as was pointed out by several data visualization specialists, is that counties don't have equal populations. So when we're looking at countywide votes, just because a county voted for a particular candidate doesn't mean that that candidate necessarily had, you know, as many votes, because counties in Wyoming are going to have a lower population density than counties in California or New York, right? Just because there's, you know, a lot more concentration of people in those areas. So the point that kind of got thrown around was this idea that land doesn't vote, right? So that county in Wyoming that has 8 people in it is not going to generate the same number of votes as a county in Southern California or a county in New York. And so they actually put together, some data scientists put together this bubble graph that kind of better demonstrates the distribution of votes. And what you see here is that the country was a lot more politically split than it appears when we just look at the county level data, when we just kind of mark a county for one candidate or the other. So something to keep in mind as you're putting together visualizations, we want to make sure that what we're representing in the visualization is actually, you know, demonstrated in the visualization that we end up choosing. And this was a great example where that didn't necessarily happen. One of the other things that we have to think about is that charts that only show a portion of especially longitudinal data. So a lot of social science research, you know, it revolves around studies that might be undertaken over a year, 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years. And so if you're only looking at a small portion of that, you're not necessarily presenting the whole picture. So we see this a lot, you know, in, again, when we're presenting information about a particularly contentious issue, we might just take a look at a small snapshot of time where something dramatic happened and kind of ignore the bigger picture and the bigger context that's surrounding that. So here's an example of what that might look like. So we have this sort of very short time period, maybe this is like a 5-month span where, you know, whatever topic we're studying, we saw a really, really dramatic increase. But what we're not necessarily looking at is how this compares to other similar time periods. So if we go to the example on the right, where we have, you know, we take this small snippet and then we kind of expand it out, take a step back and expand it out into the larger study, what we're seeing is that, yeah, this looks really dramatic in a small segment, but it's not very dramatic at all in the context of the bigger picture. And in fact, you kind of see those repeating patterns that go in a similar, or those repeating statistics that go in a similar pattern. So these are the kinds of things that, again, we can kind of do to just sort of exaggerate the findings when they seem really dramatic in small scale, but in the large scale aren't necessarily particularly compelling or aren't as dramatic as they might seem when you're putting things in context. And then finally, one of the more popular tools that we tend to see in especially infographics are things like bubble charts and other types of graphs that use size to encode some sort of meaning in terms of value or number or something like that. So one of the things that we tend to do is we actually use the wrong calculation to calculate the size of the bubbles in those bubble charts. And so we end up with kind of skewed visuals, even though our results aren't necessarily skewed. So here we have a really great example. So this is a bubble chart that is, you know, and again, I think this was from, this was kind of a specious example where they put together an example. So I don't think that this data is actually real. But if we look at the values being demonstrated here, we've got 2.3 million, I'm assuming, we've got 12.2 million, we've got 16.8 million, and then we've got 70.2 million being represented here. And when you think about this from a scale perspective, these look a little off. And the reason is that what we're using is the wrong calculation to determine the area of the bubble or the area of the circle that we need to represent it. So what we're doing here is we're taking, you know, the size of the circle, you know, the 2.3 million, and then we're just multiplying it by 4, essentially is what's happening. But if we use the proper calculation to determine the size of our bubbles, you're going to see that it looks a lot less dramatic. The differences are a lot less dramatic than they look in the previous one. especially kind of as we get to some of those lower values. So essentially, when we have to think about, creating a circle or creating another shape that's representing a relative size or a relative amount, we have to make sure we're actually using the right geometry to get a visual that represents the data accurately, as opposed to trying to kind of skew things a little bit visually. So it's one of those little things that can actually cause a lot of confusion from a visual standpoint. And then finally, we have this thing where we like to spice up some of our traditional visuals by making them 3-dimensional or 2-dimensional. This is one of my big pet peeves, because you see this done a lot with bar charts, pie charts, as we see here in this example. It's basically a way for folks who aren't necessarily schooled or skilled in data visualization to make something that they think looks a little bit different or looks a little bit more interesting than just a traditional 1-dimensional visual. But what ends up happening is it makes it really difficult when you start adding sort of artificial dimensions to a 2-dimensional object. It makes it really difficult to distinguish what the differences are. So especially in things like pie charts, when you kind of set it at this kind of weird 3/4 angle, it becomes really, really difficult, especially when you have small differences in numbers, to actually determine visually what those differences look like. So if you're going to use a bar chart, if you're going to use a pie chart, by all means, just keep it flat. Don't add another dimension, because it's going to make it harder for your viewer to interpret. All right. So how do we actually create these things? What does this look like? So some of the tools that we're going to talk about in this section are things that you can find, on your work computer. Some of them are resources that you have available as an OSU employee. Some of them are resources that you can find for free online, and we'll kind of talk about what some of those look like. So one of the easiest ways to create data visualizations is just to use the statistical software that you have available to you. So SPSS, Microsoft Excel, R, all of these can create a variety of charts and graphs. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of digging into what the actual graphing capabilities are in order to kind of figure out what the kind of breadth of your options might be. So SPSS is a statistical software package that is commonly used, especially in social sciences. I don't know if it's quite as common in bench sciences as it is in social science, but it's basically just statistical software that allows us to do kind of higher level statistical analyses than what we do in Excel. So it's like Excel, but like on steroids, I guess is the best way to describe it. But great question. Whoops, here we go. All right, so if you are like me, you like the ability to kind of customize and tailor your visualizations in a way. Yes, Summer's like, I had to deal with SPSS a lot as a graduate student. If you're like me, you like the ability to customize your visualizations and really have a lot of control over what they're going to look like, because that tends to be where those statistical software packages fall short. Right? You can generate a chart, you can generate a graph, but there's not a lot else you can do to it. You can't necessarily jazz it up to the extent that you might want to. So one of the things that I do is I actually teach students in a graduate level course how to use things like Adobe Illustrator and Adobe InDesign to create different types of visualizations, or to take the visualizations that they create in SPSS or that they create in R and actually kind of make them look more visually interesting. So Adobe Illustrator is a program where you are working with what we call vector graphics. So these are traditionally used for things like logos, icons, visuals that you're going to put on everything from business cards to websites to big print projects. So Illustrator allows you to create these really cool infographics. This is what I use for infographics. It allows you to customize charts. You can create all sorts of visuals And then you can export them in a format that you can put into a PowerPoint or put into a white paper or whatever project you happen to be working on. And it also works really well as a tool to kind of edit those graphs that you get from your statistical software. So it kind of gives you full control over what that's going to look like at the end. And then Adobe InDesign, this is the program that you traditionally use to create things like multi-page documents. This is the program I use to create like posters and research posters and fact sheets, things of that nature. You can also use it to generate and create tables if you're someone who really likes working with tabular data. So again, I teach a class kind of teaching grad students and some of our advanced undergrad students how to use these tools to take the information that they're getting from Excel, from SPSS, and kind of transform it into something that's a little bit more visually appealing, let's say. Whoops, there we go. And then if you're thinking about looking for online tools to use, so a lot of websites offer free infographics creators or things of that nature. 3 of the ones that I've utilized at some point are Canva. So Canva has it has a paid subscription level, but anyone can use it for free. You just can't have access to like the full library of options. But Canva has great templates for infographics. Pictochart is very much in the same way, where we're looking at how we can take our data and transform it into visuals. Venngage helps you make different types of charts and graphs. And these are free, they're web-based. You can find them in a Google search and they don't cost anything to utilize. So again, these are kind of taking some of the options that we have using things like Adobe Creative Cloud, but putting it on a free platform that I think is a little bit easier to pick up for folks who don't necessarily have a full fleet of Adobe skills. So Canva, Pictochart, Venngage, 3 really good platforms for creating infographics if you're looking for something free and that's easy to access. Questions so far? Thanks for keeping these in the chat, folks. Getting lots of good stuff. All right. So along the lines of actually creating your own infographics and other types of data visualizations, there are 3 principles that you want to kind of keep in mind. And this is sort of what I use as the building blocks of my data visualization class. We talk about graphic design principles, including color, type or typography, and arrangement, because these are 3 big ones that we kind of tend to just throw everything on our canvas and hope that it looks good. But these are 3 things that if we pay really close attention to as we are putting together those visualizations, they're going to make our visualizations look really good, in addition to being, statistically sound, depending on the data that you're working with, obviously. So the first principle that I want to talk about is type, and typography is like my jam. I absolutely love talking about typography. My poor undergrad students in my intro graphic design class have to sit through like a whole 20-minute long rant that I do about fonts. But one of the reasons why I do that is because, especially when we're working with infographics or visualizations that do incorporate a certain level of text, your font choice is really integral for how people respond to the visualization that you're creating, or how they're able to respond to the visualization that you're creating. Yes, Comic Sans, my nemesis, although I have a few more nemesis. At this point, I'm very tired of Myriad Pro because it's the default font in Adobe, and some of my undergrad students just kind of default to that one. And I'm like, it's so boring, gang. There's so many better options. Anyway, it's fine. So the first thing to remember is that the font that you choose, the type that you choose, it has a personality. And so Summer brought up Comic Sans. I'm assuming as a joke to watch my face turn very red, but Comic Sans has a personality attached to it, right? It looks very childlike. It's supposed to mimic hand drawing or handwriting. And the reason why Comic Sans is so universally hated by graphic designers is not because the font itself is bad. It's that the application of the font was bad. So people, back in the 90s when it was put in as as a default font option for Microsoft Office. Part of the reason why it became so hated was that everybody started using it in a professional context. And again, it's a childlike handwriting font that is not necessarily appropriate for a business professional context. I had a professor in grad school, not at Ohio State, at Texas A&M, nicest man in the world, gave all of his exams, including my comprehensive exam, in Comic Sans. And I thought he was trolling me. It was really painful, but we got through it. But I think he thought that it was approachable and nice. And so that was the choice that he was going to make. And instead I was just like, this is whatever the visual equivalent of nails on a chalkboard is, this is what I'm feeling right now. So you have to be really careful about choosing a font that is right for the context that you're designing in. It might be Comic Sans. You might have a situation where you're creating an infographic tailored toward, like I said, second or third graders. Comic Sans is a great choice. It's still pretty readable. It looks approachable. It looks youthful and fun. That in that context, it makes a lot of sense. In a comprehensive exam for a stressed out grad student, maybe not. One of the other things that we have to think about too is contrast. And we're going to talk about contrast a little bit on the next slide when we start talking about color. But contrast is basically what helps make things visible to your audience. So whether it is contrast in color, contrast in size of the type that you're using, contrasting two different styles, these contrasts help create a sense of hierarchy within your document. Right? Your title is bigger than your subheadings or bigger than your body text. And that hierarchy helps the reader kind of flow through the document. They know exactly what they're going to be looking at based on the size and the style of the typeface that you've chosen. So in that sense, giving them these kind of visual signposts to pay attention to is really important because it helps them move through the document in a way that's logical, in a way that's sort of intentional in the way that you designed it. Oh yeah, so Austin, great point. So Comic Sans, I believe, is supposed to be really good for dyslexic readers because of because I think the characters are very uniquely shaped, and so it's very hard to confuse a letter in Comic Sans for something else. So yeah, so Summer just popped that in there. So yeah, because of the non-symmetrical letters. Part of what we tend to see in things like Arial, Times New Roman, especially in like what we call sans serif fonts like Arial, the letters all look really, really similar. They're really straight up and down, straight lines, curves that all look the same. And so what ends up happening is it's really easy to confuse one letter for another when you're using something like a sans serif font. Arial doesn't, or Comic Sans doesn't have that problem because it's supposed to mimic a handwritten font. And so it, every character looks very different. And so I think that, as Summer pointed out, that's the big thing that helps with readers who have dyslexia. Text size, one of my pet peeves, especially for those of us who do things like present research posters or, put together posters for various activities. If someone can't read your poster, especially from like 8 feet away, your poster is not doing its job well. No one should have to like get up really, really close to your poster in order to read it. And, so text size is something that we want to think about. I think we're often afraid of reducing the amount of text that we have. We want to look like we know what we're talking about. And so we put all of the things on our PowerPoint slide, right? We put all of the writing on our PowerPoint slide. We put all of the writing on our poster. And really what you should be doing is reducing the number of words that you have and actually increasing the size of the text that you're using. Choose, the content really, really carefully, pinpoint the important stuff, put stuff in bullet points, and then make your text bigger because it's going to be a lot easier for more people to read. So, don't worry about throwing everything on your poster or everything on your slide or everything on your infographic. Really pick and choose. Yes, Misty, this happens all the time at poster competitions. Really picking and choosing the information that's important for the reader to have. And then, in most situations, especially at like a poster competition, you have an opportunity to explain things more fully verbally. And you can answer questions, you can elaborate in your discussion. You don't necessarily have to do all of the elaboration on your poster, or at least you shouldn't if you've set the research up well. So yeah, so if you're wondering like poster sizes, usually I try 6 line. Yes, Gwen, that's a great point. So no more than 6 lines of type or 6 words per line. The whole point of PowerPoint design or slideshow design is you want to reduce the number of words as much as possible. And you want to be, you as the presenter want to be sort of the focus of the presentation and not necessarily the slide. The slide should just be there for emphasis. But yeah, if you're interested in poster sizes, especially, the minimum text size you should have is about like 28 points. I usually try to shoot for 36 because that's about a 1/2 inch high, and it's pretty easy to read from like 5, 6, 7, 8 feet away. There's your helpful hint for today.
So question on that,
Yeah.
why would our college areas, when they give us the branded poster templates, do it that way?
I think because the accepted, I think it really depends on finding a balance between what certain academic or scholarly fields want to be able to do with a poster versus what is actually readable and useful. And so I think what the college guidelines try to do is kind of find a happy medium between that. I don't necessarily think that they've quite gotten to the point where they make the poster template or they help, they don't make the poster template so that it functions as something particularly readable. Because, when you think about, I don't mean to pick on our animal scientists or crop scientists or any of those folks who are in bench science. Their focus, I think, is more on sharing as much information as possible on a poster, as opposed to, worrying about how readable it is. And I think that that's sort of a thing that we need to move away from in this type of science communication, where, maybe not necessarily having just a glut of information available, but making sure that the information that we're sharing is relevant and necessary for someone to know. And then kind of leaning a little bit more on sort of the discussion part, the verbal communication, the interaction. And I think that too, from what I have seen, is that it seems like a lot of bench science conferences tend to have poster sessions where the posters aren't necessarily manned for a long period of time. And so I think the idea there is that you should have all of the information available on the poster so that if you do have to walk away, but the poster remains hanging, the reader can get all of the information. I think we just don't necessarily do a good job of kind of picking out what the important stuff is for the reader to know. And instead, we just kind of err on the side of volume. And Heather put a great point in the chat. If you're doing something like a poster presentation, having a handout that actually goes into the more detailed information, whether what I like to do is, sometimes have a handout that has a PDF of my poster, like the visual of the poster, and then maybe a copy of the abstract on the back or something like that, so that if anyone wants to know the details, then they can walk away with the handout, as opposed to like making you put all of that stuff on the poster that you're trying to present. So Heather, that's a really, really great point. Any other questions or comments on type? Because now we're going to talk about color, which is my other favorite thing to talk about. All right, so we talked about color or contrast in the context of type, and contrast is one of the things that we really, really need to focus on with color as well. So one of the things that we tend to find is that there are certain pairs of colors that work really well together. There's certain pairs of colors that really, really do not play well together. And I think sometimes we focus a little bit less on making sure that we're providing enough contrast, as opposed to, just following brand guidelines and following what our templates tell us to do. I feel really fortunate at Ohio State that we work with a brand guide with, for color that actually does have a lot of really good contrast and makes things a little bit easier for us. I feel for the folks at like the University of Florida who are dealing with orange and blue, some of the folks who work with, bright oranges and whites and blacks. Those are a little bit harder to kind of navigate around. So one of the things that we want to think about when we're choosing colors for our visualizations is making sure that we provide that level of contrast that's really, really ideal for reading. So things like putting bright yellow type on a white background. I'm sorry that I have this slide up for so long, because if you all stare at that too long, it's going to start hurting your eyes, and I apologize. I do an entire slide in my graphic design class, and every single time all the students are like, oh no, please don't do that. So, bright light type on a white background, not particularly great. One of the things that I tend to see in PowerPoints especially is this idea that we have dark backgrounds. I think people think black backgrounds are really dramatic, and then they'll put like a blue type or a red type on top of it. What we're doing here is, again, we're kind of reducing the contrast between the background of our image and the type, and that makes it hard to read, and in some cases kind of painful to read. One of the pairs of colors that actually causes eye strain is a bright blue background with red text on top of it. So again, I feel for folks who have to work inside like these kind of templates, these brand guides that have really, really strong colors that don't necessarily play well together. When in doubt, have a white background and put black text on it. That's really, the easiest color combination to read. So, when in doubt, when you're working on an infographic, when you're working on a PowerPoint slide, when you're working on a research poster, err on the side of that simple white background, put white text on it. Again, if you have like spot colors that you want to use, like the red and Ohio State's brand guidelines, utilize those, judiciously, but it's really about choosing colors that help your text or help your content stand out on the background. So something really important to look at. We also, when we want to think about color use, again, we want to use it judiciously. We want to use color for emphasis as opposed to for grabbing people's attention and blinding them with our visual brilliance, right? So you want to use enough color to accommodate the data, especially if you're working with something that has a key, kind of like the kudzu vine that we infographic that we looked at, or map that we looked at. But you want to use color for emphasis whenever possible. So things like applying color to your data points as opposed to an entire graph. Matching the color that you choose to the context of the visual. So again, thinking about that kudzu vine example, where we had a key that included green, but they used green for the wrong thing, essentially. They were looking at using it for the wrong finding. So some examples of this, thinking about what colors mean in particular contexts. So looking at the top example over here on the left-hand side, where we have our not ideal examples, we tend to associate the color red with stop, bad, negative things. So here we have a pie chart where it's actually being used to indicate a good outcome, and green is being used to indicate a bad outcome. Not necessarily intuitive for a Western, a Western viewer to understand. The center example here is a great one that kind of ties back to what we talked about with the kudzu vine, where forests are indicated in blue and lakes are indicated in green. And then thinking about the bottom example here, where we have, we tend to think of, I'm not entirely sure about this one. This one doesn't really bother me quite as much, because I don't think that we have as many color associations between men and women. But I think if you use like pink for men and blue for women, people would be very confused, simply because our Western culture teaches us that pink is a color associated with femininity, blue is a color associated with masculinity. So being aware of like the cultural context that you're presenting in, being aware of what certain colors might mean to a certain audience member. So some things that we want to think about. And then finally, we have arrangement. So we want to think really critically about the ways that we put content into a particular project. One of the things that we want to be really good about doing is grouping objects that should be grouped together. I'm always shocked at the number of captions that seem to kind of float away from images on posters or on PowerPoint slides. Having keys for your visualizations that aren't close to the actual visualization itself. So making sure that anytime you have those elements that really need to be together, making sure that they are physically close together and easy to identify as being part of the same visual. You also want to be really careful with alignment. I am a big fan of using of putting columns into slides, putting columns into documents that I'm trying to use, and using, PowerPoint has gotten much better about this, about having the little guides that pop up that tell you when something's like in the center of the slide or aligned along the right side of the slide. Using those tools to help you align objects with each other is hugely, hugely helpful. One of the other things to think about, especially if you're using or creating an infographic or another type of kind of, advanced visual, making sure that you have some way of visually connecting different elements, whether it's having a line that takes you from one side of the infographic to the other, using arrows to indicate directionality. Those types of things are really, really good at making sure that the audience knows where to start and knows where to finish, and then knows how to get from one element to the other in between. So an example of this that I really love using, I use this one in my data viz class a lot, because it kind of combines all of the things that we've talked about today. It talks about, it combines really good use of type. We've got a light background with black text on top of it. All of the captions for all of the information are really easy to read. We've also got really judicious use of color, where each color actually represents something different. And then all of those colors are combined in that kind of final step of the infographic in the lower right-hand corner. And then we have really careful use of arrangement, where we've got these kind of dotted lines leading us through the infographic in a way that indicates we know exactly where we're supposed to start. And it actually says it starts with the market, right? And then you follow the little dotted line through the infographic. And then it has a logical ending point. And so, we're basically seeing examples. Whoops, sorry about that. My mouse is really sensitive today. So just kind of looking at how we can take color, how we can take typography, how we can take arrangement, and put them together in a way that makes a lot of sense. So Heather asked, I like to alternate alignment of photos, graphics on PowerPoint. Is that a good or bad thing? When you say alternate alignment, Heather, what do you mean?
I guess like when I'm going through a series of presentation or slide presentations, what I like to do is like maybe, kind of work between like left to center to right if it fits with my visualization. But in common things, when I'm combining text and photos or text and graphics, I like to see some aligned on the left, some aligned on the right. So as I'm moving through, it just kind of creates, it's not like they're all aligned to the left or they're all in the center or they're all on the right. It's to me, it's like a flow type thing, so that it's not visual boredom, right? Where where my slide pops up. And so that's my thought process there, was that I feel like it connects my slide presentation together a little bit. And maybe I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Well, I think it can absolutely be a good thing. And I have the same struggle too when I'm putting together, I'm teaching a graduate theory class this semester, where we do a lot of discussion, and I don't want my slides to be super, super text heavy. And so what I find myself doing is having like a visual, right? And then some type of little descriptive caption next to it. And, I'm kind of with you, where I don't like those slides to all look the same. I think one thing to keep in mind is, if you're keeping other elements, if you're keeping your text a similar size, if you're using similar styles and colors, there's absolutely no reason why you can't still have, some visual playfulness there with having different alignments throughout. I think it's when we start adding like different alignment with different type styles, with different colors, that things start kind of going a little haywire. But you're absolutely right that there are ways that we can use these things, using different alignments, using different using different colors and highlights to mean different things that can help keep our audiences visually engaged. So I don't see any problem with that at all. I think as long as you're keeping your text similar, you're keeping your colors similar, keeping similar sizes of objects, there's no reason why you can't play around with the alignment a little bit to kind of jazz things up a little bit.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so I am finishing up with about 4 minutes left for questions. And if any of you are continuing on in your professional development or in your education, I do teach this class. It's called AgCom 5535. It's data visualization and scientific storytelling in food, ag, and environmental sciences. As I put here, this is a shameless plug for anyone who's interested in taking the class, auditing the class, if you're working on a master's degree or a PhD as part of your extension professional development. It is taught at the 5,000 level, so it does count as an elective for a PhD program, and it will count for graduate credit for most people. And it's also just kind of fun to audit. I've had a couple of folks who have come in and just taken it for fun. And it's a really, really fun class because we practice some of the things that we talked about today and kind of break it up into a whole 15 weeks and get to do some presentations and talk about all of the fun things that we can do with our data. And with that, are there any questions in addition to the ones that we've already kind of talked through? And if you have any questions that pop up later, here you'll see my email address, my phone number. Oh, let's see, Beth, it is taught, it's usually Tuesdays and Thursdays, and it's taught every other fall. So we will be, it's taught in odd fall semesters. So we won't be teaching it this coming fall semester, but it will be taught in fall of 2023. So yeah, it's usually like mid-afternoon, late afternoon on Tuesdays and Thursdays. But that always can change depending on whether or not my computer lab is available. So, and we are bringing in a new AgCom faculty member, so there might be a chance, hopefully, knock on wood, that we actually get to teach this every fall semester. So I've got my fingers crossed for that.
Do the students adopt community programs at all for their project work?
They can, absolutely. So I've worked with some faculty members outside of our department and inside of our department to have data sets essentially for some of the students who are either undergrads who haven't conducted research yet, or who are not necessarily haven't conducted research in their grad program yet. So we actually had some really great, presentations based on some AED info that came from one of their projects about marijuana production in California. And I still need to share those out with the research team. But we had a number of students who kind of grabbed onto that particular project and made some really cool visualizations for it. So those are the kinds of things that we like to do. So if you have a project that you're just looking for something, you're looking for opportunities to create visuals for, you need some help creating visuals, this is a great class to either take or to audit, because we can absolutely take what you're already working on and use that as the source for your information. Any other questions before we wrap up? Y'all have been a great virtual audience. This is way better than my undergrad students who just stare at me when they're on the Zoom call. So thank you for having me. Thank you for participating, and hopefully y'all got a little something out of this presentation today.
Thank you, Dr. Specht, for coming today. And I put the session evaluation in the chat for those of you, if you would like to take that evaluation. We would appreciate it. All right, I'll stick on for another minute to make sure everybody doesn't have any more questions.
All right, and Summer, I'm more than happy to share my slides with anyone who's interested. So okay. I'm happy to send you a PDF if you'd like, and then you can share them out with the participants.
That would be great. I'm .70.
Perfect. All right, and I actually have to run because I gotta go to class.
Oh, have fun at class.
I will. Thank you all again, and have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, Annie. That's very interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I've seen that presentation once before in grad school, but it's always a great refresher. Yeah, I'm like, I want to take that class.
I was hoping it was going to be this fall. I didn't realize it was every other year.
Well, maybe, yeah, I did just see they hired someone, so I'm excited for that, and maybe they'll offer it again. So, all right.
Well, I have to go facilitate another workshop. Have a good day, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I'll hop off now too.